Question 25. Since it says in 1 Corinthians chapter 14 verse 34 that women should keep silent in the churches, it doesn't seem like your position is really biblical because of how much speaking you really do allow to women. How do you account for this straightforward prohibition of women speaking? The reason we believe Paul does not mean for women to be totally silent in the church is that in 1 Corinthians chapter 11 verse 5, he permits women to pray and prophesy in church. Every wife who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head. But someone may ask, why do you choose to let 1 Corinthians chapter 11 verse 5 limit the meaning of 1 Corinthians chapter 14 verse 34, rather than the other way around? To begin our answer, we notice in both 1 Corinthians chapter 14 verse 35 and 1 Corinthians chapter 11 verse 6 that Paul is concerned about what is shameful or disgraceful for women. The issue is not whether women are competent or intelligent or wise or well taught. The issue is how they relate to the men of the church. In 1 Corinthians chapter 14 verse 34, Paul speaks of submission, and in 1 Corinthians chapter 11 verse 3, he speaks of man as head. So the issue of shamefulness is, at root, an issue of doing something that would dishonor the role of the men as leaders of the congregation. If all speaking were shameful in this way, then Paul could not have condoned a woman's praying and prophesying, as he does in 1 Corinthians chapter 11 verse 5, precisely when the issue of shamefulness is what is at stake. But Paul shows in 1 Corinthians chapter 11 verses 5 to 16, that what is at stake is not that women are praying and prophesying in public, but how they are doing it. That is, are they doing it with the dress and demeanor that signify their affirmation of the headship of the men who are called to lead the church? In a similar way, we look into the context of 1 Corinthians chapter 14 verses 33 to 36. To find similar clues for the kind of speaking Paul may have in mind when he says it is shameful for a woman to speak. We notice again that the issue is not the ability or the wisdom of women to speak intelligently, but how women are relating to men. Some kind of interaction is taking place that Paul thinks compromises the calling of the men to be the primary leaders of the church. Chapter 6 of Recovering Biblical Manhood and Womanhood argues in detail that the inappropriate interaction relates to the testing of prophecies, referred to in 1 Corinthians chapter 14 verse 29. Women are taking a role here that Paul thinks is inappropriate. Answer: it's in this activity of public judgment on spoken prophecies that he calls them to be silent. In other words, in both 1 Corinthians chapter 11 and 1 Corinthians chapter 14, Paul is calling for not the total silence of women but a kind of involvement that signifies, in various ways, the glad affirmation of the leadership of the men God has called to be the guardians and overseers of the flock.